Hello and welcome to this video on employer-employee relations. So by the end of this video we should be able to explain why the objectives of businesses may come into conflict with the objectives of employees, differentiate between an individual approach and a collective approach to resolving conflict, and analyse the pros and cons of using collective bargaining to resolve disputes. Of course, good relationships between employers, the owners or the managers, and employees, the basic workers within the business, are very important. Happy managers and happy workers make for a motivated and productive workforce and a successful business overall. But sometimes the relationships between employers and employees can deteriorate, and typically over issues such as pay and working conditions. For example, in the top left, teachers may complain that they don't get paid enough. The introduction of 0 hours contracts by many companies has been a point of conflict for many workers in recent years. Being overworked, working too many hours a week like this doctor in the bottom left, might be another complaint. Also, the increased use of robotics and automation for many businesses have left some workers demotivated and sometimes unemployed. So often conflict will result in the worker leaving the business, or often conflict will be as a result of the business wanting a worker to leave the business. And that brings us to these two terms, dismissal and redundancy. We need to know the distinction between these two terms. So dismissal is the termination of employment by an employer against the will of the employee. So this decision can be made by an employer for a number of reasons, ranging from economic downturn to performance-related problems on the part of the employee. If you're dismissed, normally there is no further pay. However, there may be legal action in some countries. Redundancy is when the employment is terminated for business reasons. So maybe the business is trying to reduce the size of its workforce, or maybe there is no longer any work for that particular worker to do. In UK law, this is specifically if the business is no longer work for that employee, or those needs have diminished. Normally, if you're made redundant, you get a compensation package. So in more simpler terms, dismissal implies that the employee is at fault, it's their misconduct, they haven't been doing the job properly, whereas redundancy implies that it's to do with market conditions or the business's strategy and not the employee's fault as to why they're being made unemployed. So some more related key terms on this area. A resignation, that is when the employee makes a formal act of giving up their job. Downsizing, mentioned a couple of times there, downsizing where a business completely or permanently reduces the number of staff that it has, normally a cost-saving exercise. And voluntary redundancy. Voluntary redundancy is normally the case where an organisation offers a financial incentive to employees if they voluntarily choose to resign. So this can often be used if the business wants to downsize or restructure its workforce. The purpose of this is to avoid dismissals or redundancies, maybe to avoid some of the employee regulation laws that operate around that, by saying, does anyone want to leave their job for this particular payment? So if there is conflict between an employer and an employee over pay or working conditions, how can they go about resolving this conflict? Well, there are two broad approaches. The first is the individual approach, and that's when the single worker negotiates their pay and working conditions with the management, and that's done on an individual case-by-case basis. The other approach is called a collective approach, and that's where management negotiate with employees through representatives of the employees. So for example, a work council, or more commonly a trade union. So a trade union is an organization made up of members from a particular industry. And the job of that union is to protect the members' interests and improve their terms and conditions at work. So for example, in the UK, teachers are often members, or a lot of teachers are members of the National Union of Teachers. And it is this organisation that negotiates the pay of teachers with the government, not the individual teachers and their schools. So the key objectives of trade unions are to secure jobs, to maximise pay, to ensure safe and acceptable working conditions, and that their employees are treated fairly by employers. So we call this collective bargaining, and we do this to try and maybe offset the power that the business has. So for example, if one teacher tries to negotiate their salary with the school might say, well, we don't have to pay you very much because if we don't offer you a contract, then we'll just get another teacher to take your place. Now, if all the teachers get together in a union and the union says you need to pay all these teachers this amount or they're all going to walk out, then all of a sudden the school is in a different situation. It can't suddenly offer a lower wage rate because it runs the risk of losing all its teachers. So the teachers might be in a stronger position here through collective bargaining. So are there any advantages to businesses of collective bargaining? Well, we might say that the negotiations are likely to be fairer. The trade unions can balance the power of the large employees. Maybe we're going to have a more rules-based negotiation to settle pay and working conditions. But generally speaking, businesses would say that collective bargaining is not great for the business, because it's likely to lead to them having to improve conditions for workers and paying them more. It might be motivational, but it's going to increase costs. Any disadvantages to businesses of collective bargaining? Well, negotiations can be lengthy and therefore expensive. Unions might not accurately represent the views of all members. And a failure to reach an agreement can lead to what's known as industrial action. So that might be when the workers, the teachers perhaps, might say, well, if we haven't reached an agreement on what you're going to pay or the conditions, we're not going to turn up. We're going to go on strike. It means we don't get paid, but also it means there's a problem for the school in terms of not having staff to perform the work. A couple of examples here of news stories. On the left-hand side, British Airways cabin crew were negotiating their pay through a work council or a trade union, and they weren't happy with the offer, so they decided to take industrial action. They decided to walk out of British Airways for 48 hours. They wouldn't get paid, but they wouldn't work either. So that would have serious implications for British Airways. They couldn't operate any flights, and this would force British Airways maybe to try and improve the working conditions. On the right hand side, this is a comment here from the Prime Minister Theresa May in the UK, saying that 100,000 days of work have been lost due to industrial action, and that some trade unions had contempt for passengers. And this is in relation to some rail workers who were going on strike, and so the trains weren't running. And she was saying, well, they're showing contempt for passengers because the trains have been stopped while they protest about working pay and conditions. So in this video, we've looked at why the objectives of businesses may come into conflict with the objectives of employees, the difference between an individual approach in terms of negotiation and a collective approach through trade unions, and looked at the pros and cons of collective bargaining in the context of different businesses. That's it. Thanks very much for listening.